Hello, everybody. It's a tricky thing. How to teach America's history, how to tell the story of America. It's a big, complicated, controversial subject. But my guest today has been called America's government teacher. She's a well known Instagram pundit, she's a celebrity. Very well known, as I said, on Instagram. I think she has over 1 million followers, and she has her name is Sharon McMahon. Many of you will be heard of her. She is known in some ways as America's teacher, and she has a new book out which attempts to tell America's story, the small and the mighty. And she's joining us from northern Minnesota. Sharon, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's your first book. Sharon, did you struggle with telling American history? That's, I assume, what you try to do in the classroom.
Well, it's not a struggle because there's a million amazing stories to tell. But understanding how to tell the truth in a way that is accessible, exciting, and readable is the challenge. Uh, Too often, history has whitewashed the truth. Too often, we have glossed over stories that were important, but that person didn't have the biggest armies or the most money. They're not on a marble bust in some state capital. So often, those people's stories are overlooked. And so, telling their stories in a way that is honest is part of the challenge. And the other aspect of this that is especially challenging, which is one reason often their stories are not told, is that because many people that I discuss in the book were not famous in their lifetimes. That means that very often there are not really fantastic records. And so it was unlike the Thomas Jeffersons, who left behind copious amounts of their own writings, tons of records on all the things they did. Many of the small and the mighty are people who needed to be unearthed, and it required years of research to be able to tell their stories well.
Unearthed, you are then the American archaeologist.
Archaeologist.
When I was looking at the book, I thought of Dr. Martin Luther King's famous remarks about the moral universe being long but bending towards justice. Is that the invisible narrative, the thread in the book about America bending towards justice, not through the great, the Jeffersons, the Madisons, even the Kings, but people we don't know about?
I think in many ways it is that great Americans have impacted history in a huge variety of ways and that we're just not aware of. And I think stories like the ones in this book demonstrate exactly how much of an impact an individual or a small group of people can have on that bend in the moral universe. That there are many people who are helping the moral universe to bend, whose names we don't know. And I think many times you will find that their stories are far more relatable, far more accessible. None of us fancy ourselves to be a George Washington or a Benjamin Franklin. We're not out here with a key and a kite. I'm not out here inventing bifocals. I'm not Andrew Carnegie. I don't have, millions or billions of dollars. Who am I? I think that's very often how Americans feel. Who am I to bend the moral arc of the universe? And the stories in this book illustrate exactly who you have to be to contribute in that way. And it's often just somebody with the desire to keep going, the audacity to keep trying despite all evidence to the contrary.
Well, we're going to get to some of those small but audacious people in a few minutes, Sharon. But I'm curious in terms of how you think of history and the telling of this complicated narrative. Is America somehow different from other countries? Or if you were a scholar, a student, a reader on France or the United Kingdom or Nigeria or Australia or Botswana, would you find the same small and mighty making that bend in the moral universe?
Hmm. That's a great question. America is different than other countries. And that's not to say it's always better. It's not that the saying they're different or saying that America is different does not necessarily mean that I'm placing it above other countries or that America has, unmitigated exceptionalism in every way. But it is a unique country in the world. It's for a variety of reasons. It's a unique place in the way that it began. It continues to be a unique place in that it is a country of immigrants. It is not a place with one shared common heritage that is common in other places in the world. It's a very multicultural, pluralistic society, and that makes it difficult to govern. And that makes also for a variety of really, really interesting stories to be told, a broad diversity of stories to be told. So, if I were a historian from another country who did not grow up in the United States, was not surrounded by these kinds of stories, and I went looking for who the small and the mighty are, I do think I'd arrive at many of the same conclusions. And of course, this book is not an exhaustive history of every single person that has ever impacted the moral universe of the United States, but I do think I would land on the impacts that some of these individuals had and put my finger on that moment in time and realize that it really was remarkable.
The book is a narrative about moral agency. It's about people who have made the world a better place. Is there something unique about this focus on moral agency, on the idea of America not just making itself a better place, but making the world better? Or do you think if you went to other countries, you'd find the same kind of moral narrative?
Mm. Well, of course, every country has their own culture about what makes a country great. If I went to China and interviewed people or researched the history, their perspective about what makes China great, for example, might be quite different than an American definition of greatness. But I do think there are some things that many democracies around the world have in common. That are not unique to the United States. These are things like the rights of citizens, the rights of people to be free from discrimination, free from injustice perpetrated by the government. The rights of individuals have been added to over time. These are things that many democracies have in common, but there is a very unique American flavor in these stories. And I think most of the world acknowledges that America is unique in the world. And again, that's not to say it's better in every way, but it's a unique place to study. And I think, regardless of where you are tuning in from around the world, there is hope and inspiration in each of these stories. You do not need to be an American to realize that you can be small and mighty wherever you are.
Sharon, I have another show called Keen on America. It's actually a feature on Keen on, but we focus on America and distinguished Americans. We probably should have included this interview in Keen on America. But I always begin my conversations with prominent Americans by asking them whether and how they think of themselves as Americans. What's your relationship personally with Americanness? Have you always felt strongly patriotic? Have you been, has it always shaped your identity? I know you've moved around the country a lot. You're in northern Minnesota now. You had lived as a teacher in the East Bay and the San Francisco area and Fremont. So you know the country pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also lived in Washington, D.C. for many years, so I definitely got an up close and personal view of America from both coasts and the middle. So, I have always, I can recall times as a child feeling quite patriotic. My father was a disabled veteran who later died of his war related injuries. And
Which
despite
war?
the Vietnam War, and despite all of the controversy surrounding the Vietnam War, very warranted controversy, despite all of that, he always felt proud of his service. And so I remember as a child, feeling glad to be an American. That's something that a lot of children, I think, are taught to feel. And then as I got to be, a college student, got to be a young teacher, I definitely noticed myself re-examining some beliefs that perhaps I had been that had developed in me as a child, questioning whether America's place in the world was warranted, and whether the United States has used its hegemony in a moral fashion in every place around the world. And I think if you're being honest, you can say that America is a flawed country. But I think if you're also being honest, you can say it is also a remarkable one. And it is a country that I love. It is a country that I am proud to be from. And because it is a country that I love, it's important to me that I do my part to keep making it a better place. Because I love and believe in it, I want it to be more than it is. I want it to be better tomorrow than it was yesterday. So I think, like most Americans, there are things that we would look back on in the past and be like, oh no, why did we do that? That was terrible. There are certainly some of those stories in this book. But ultimately, as an adult, my viewpoint is one of that I'm happy to be an American. And because I love America, I want it to be the best version of itself.
There are many traditions, political philosophies, other philosophies in the American tradition. There is, of course, I guess you might be fitted into the Jeffersonian tradition of focusing on morality, although, of course, Thomas Jefferson wasn't always the most moral of people.
No.
But there's an alternative narrative, maybe a Hamiltonian one with a focus on power and self-interest. Is that, in your view, equally credible? This is not, of course, what your book is about. You could have alternatively written a book, as you suggested, The High and the Mighty, about the Alexander Hamiltons of the world. Is that a credible narrative, or do you reject it entirely?
A credible narrative that the United States is as much about...
That's legitimate. I mean, if we had a Hamiltonian on the show, they might say, well, this is as legitimately American in terms of building a narrative of this country as Sharon. Would you accept that?
I don't disagree with either of those things. I think America is both. And I think that that clash between the Hamiltons and the Jeffersons is part of what has made up the fabric of America. That it's neither entirely about power, nor is it about morality. As you pointed out, Thomas Jefferson was not the most moral of men, despite his proclamations to the contrary. A lot of Americans would be surprised to know that Thomas Jefferson wrote his own version of the Bible. That seems a Jefferson Bible. That seems ridiculous today, that a political figure would be like, well, you know what? I made some additions and some subtractions. Here's my version of the Christian Bible. You can still buy it on or buy it on Amazon, by the way.
That reminds us of a certain, maybe we shouldn't mention his name, but a certain contemporary American politician
associating himself with the Bible. Sure. And this Jefferson even went a step farther. He didn't just say, this is my endorsed version of the Bible. He actually made changes to it and excised passages that had things in it he disagreed with. And that's an example of how Jefferson used his moral philosophy to try to influence the world, as he literally, in some cases, rewrote scripture, Holy Scripture, in his own view. So I think more than we need to choose between a Hamiltonian or a Jeffersonian view of the world, I think America is what it is because we have elements of the best of both of their viewpoints. And America, was founded very much despite George Washington's caution to not give in to excess factionalism, to not have allegiance to party. Political parties were not part of the founding of America, but they developed not long afterwards. And America struggled with this two-party binary at its inception between the Hamiltons and the Adams Federalist camp and the Democratic Republicans of the Jefferson viewpoint. And it is this clash that has helped form the character of America. There are elements of both of these things that are evident today. So I don't necessarily know that it's one or the other. I think we need both. And America still has a two-party binary for better or for worse. I would argue that it's for worse in many ways, but that's part of our unique nature.
Sharon, one more question before we get to the book. The small and the mighty, as I said, you're not sure you're small, but you're certainly mighty, at least on Instagram. You're very well known. On Substack, you have a wonderful newsletter, The Preamble, that has several 100,000 subscribers. Do you think of yourself, I mean, you didn't include yourself, you're not that type of writer, but are you in your own way an example of the small and the mighty? I mean, you began life, as you said, the daughter of a disabled Vietnam veteran. You've spent your life as a school teacher. You didn't have the natural advantages of others. Is there something small and mighty about yourself, or at least about your own life?
That's a really sweet question. It's one that I haven't really spent much time pondering. I hope that someday my descendants look me up on the internet. I hope someday if I have grandchildren, great grandchildren, that they'll Google my name and that they will arrive at the conclusion that, like, wow, she was somebody worth knowing. She was someone to be proud of. So rather than, elevating myself to some kind of status of, oh, I deserve to have a book written about me, I don't spend time thinking about that, but I do hope to leave a legacy for my descendants that they can be proud of. And, if that makes me small and mighty, then so be it. But the people in this book didn't spend time thinking about how people of the future would write about them, and I certainly don't either.
The subtitle of the book is Unsung American Hero, not American Heroes, Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History from the Founding to the Civil Rights Movement. There's a strong focus on race and civil rights. We've already talked about Martin Luther King. We've already also talked about Jefferson. I was at Monticello earlier this year, and one is really struck by the fact, even if they're trying to do a good job at Monticello in promoting Jefferson, one leaves there with a horrible, chilling feeling of Jefferson as not just a founding father, but a major slave owner. How central, in your view, in terms of the narrative of your book, and we'll talk about some of the people in the book in a second, but these 12 unsung Americans, in terms of this reshaping of the arc of the moral universe, from slavery to civil rights, is this the driving, if there is a driving narrative in the book within American history, is this the one?
I don't know that it's necessarily race, but I do think it is related to rights in many ways. And of course, there is a strong intersection between race and rights. There's a lot of questioning of what does it mean to be an American? And the people in this book arrived at different conclusions. They had different journeys to grappling with that decision. Some people are the children of immigrants. Some people are Japanese Americans who are incarcerated in camps during World War II, although they've been charged with no crime and are literal children. Some people were denied their right to serve America during World War II, and then at the last minute were granted the ability to serve in the armed forces and then suffered lifelong repercussions from that. Some of the people were formerly enslaved and went on to have an absolutely historic impact on the United States that is still being felt today. So I do think very often the stories that remain hidden from view, that are waiting to be excavated, so to speak, are stories that are of people who have been historically marginalized, whether that is women, whether that is people from different racial backgrounds, different immigrant communities. Very often, it is those stories that are eclipsed by the dominant sons of of American history, the people with the large bank accounts and the title general in front of their name, or the people who hold elected office. Often it is these stories of people who are marginalized that are excluded from that narrative. And so the book does have a very strong emphasis on telling those kinds of stories.
Although that is very much an American narrative of being excluded and then being included, the rebellion against the British, and perhaps even the story, at least in ideal terms, of the shift from slavery to civil rights.
Mm.
Let's begin. You begin the book with a woman I have to admit I had never heard of, Clara Brown, from the Kentucky of the 1830s. Tell us about Clara and why she's so sort of emblematic, if you like, of the small and the mighty.
Well, Clara is born in around the year 1800. She's born enslaved. And she was the mother of 4 children. One of her children, something tragic happens to one of her children. And the rest of her family is sold as she is forced to watch them step up onto the auction block. And one by one, as her children and her husband are sold to different owners. And then she too finds herself sold as an enslaved woman. And eventually, Clara is granted her freedom. And this does not come, out of any sense of, big benevolence. It comes just out of by the virtue of the way the legal system worked and the way wills worked. She is essentially granted her freedom for the first time in her life. And she has never forgotten her children, of course, no mother would. And she goes on a lifelong quest to be reunited with her children. But one of the things that she did that is truly remarkable is she was a pioneer of the state of Colorado. Colorado is what it is in some ways because of Clara Brown. In fact, she is one of the first African Americans in the state of Colorado. She comes into a large personal fortune that she makes of her own volition. I say in the book that she's the actual definition of self-made, because everything that she had, she earned from the sweat of her own brow. And her contributions to the state of Colorado have, earned her accolades from historians there. There's a, stained glass windows dedicated to her. She's an official Colorado pioneer. But of course, the history of Colorado goes on to dramatically impact the rest of the United States as well. But Clara was known as the Angel of the Rockies. That was the nickname that she earned during her lifetime. And the rest of this very dramatic story that I tell in the book illustrates perfectly this thing that you are referring to, this concept you're referring to. Somebody Martin Luther King would look back on and point to how she is somebody who helped just very slightly bend the arc of the moral universe.
Nudge it, please. Maybe not bend
Nudges it. Yes, nudges it in the right direction.
Nudger, and maybe that's the nature of American history. You follow up, Clara, again. I hadn't heard of a lot of the people in the book. You follow up with Virginia Randolph, Catherine Lee Bates, a couple of more African American women, Inez Milhollander, and Anna Jeans. These 4 women. Tell me what they had in common. I mean, we can't deal with all of them, but is there something that ties these 4 women and Clara Brown together as 19th century Americans?
Well, the stories do intersect in some ways. Virginia Randolph and Anna Jeans in particular, their stories intersect. And Virginia Randolph is a woman who is a pioneer of African American education in the United States. Her work is on par with people who are far more famous than her, people like Booker T. Washington, who have earned a spot in sort of the pantheon of American greats. Her work is, even during her time, people said that she deserves as much or more credit than people like Booker T. Washington receive. And there are all kinds of high schools around the South named Booker T. Washington High, and yet there are very few monuments and memorials to Virginia Randolph, whose work was remarkably significant. But Virginia Randolph's work was made possible by Anna Jeanes. They did not know each other personally. Anna Jeanes became a philanthropist. It's a very interesting story of how she acquires large sums of money, and an interesting story about what she decides to do with it. She meets with somebody who will become the United States president. This person comes to her home. She's a very elderly woman at this point, dying of cancer, less than 80 pounds, and they come to her, and they essentially are at her beck and call. She wants to give her fortune away in a way that will impact the United States. But she does not want her name attached to it. She was a Quaker woman, and her belief was that if you do good work, as you are commanded in Scripture to do, that the right hand should not know what the left is doing. Do not seek for yourselves, treasure on earth, store up for yourselves riches in heaven. And that is where your reward will come. So we don't know stories like Anna Jeanes's because she intentionally left her name off of everything.
So
And
she's rather different, even from the do-gooders and wealthy, the philanthropists like
that's right.
Steve Jobs' widow, or Bill Gates, or Jeff Bezos. Is rather different. It's interesting, Sharon, you've mentioned the great Booker T a couple of times. He isn't someone one would have expected to show up in a book called The Small and the Mighty. Of course, everyone remembers him as having an interesting debate with Du Bois about African Americans and their ambitions. Why did you include Booker T in the book?
Yeah, he was an important figure in this story because there is another individual who that I profile. His name is Julius Rosenwald, who does something truly remarkable. But the way that Julius Rosenwald is even sort of given the opportunity to do something remarkable is because of his friendship with Booker T. Washington. And there's also a connection.
That Julius Rosenwald was an American businessman and philanthropist, as the part owner of Sears Roebuck. So he was the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos of his time.
Yeah, in many ways he was. And what's fascinating about Julius Rosenwald too is that he even says, he comes into this fortune as the owner of Sears and Roebuck. He comes into his fortune, as in his words, by chance and proximity, by luck and proximity. He was his father was a peddler. His father was an immigrant from Europe who was a peddler. They came to the United States with nothing. They eventually have a unique connection to Abraham Lincoln in that the Rosenwald family lived down the street from the Lincoln family before Abraham Lincoln was ever famous. And now the Rosenwald family home is on the Lincoln historic property in Illinois. But aside from that, when Julius Rosenwald becomes fabulously rich and decides that he has everything he could ever want in life, the vacations and the beautiful home and the furs for his wife and the children who have everything they've ever wanted, he decides he's going to do something very, very unique with his money. And he gives away he gives away his entire fortune, which is the equivalent of over $1 billion today. And one of the ways that he was able to even conceptualize a world in which he would not die with riches was because of his friendship with Booker T. Washington. So Booker, of course, is as I mentioned, is a well-known figure in U.S. history. But this is an element of his story that most people have never heard of. This is not about how he founded Tuskegee or the friendships that he had with Teddy Roosevelt. Those are very well documented. This is a story of his friendship with a different man who has a very different impact on U.S. history.
I would have guessed, Sharon, given your life as a teacher and the value you have clearly in teaching and pedagogy, and the importance of teaching, that you might have been a little ambivalent about Booker T, given that Tuskegee, at least according to some of his critics, like Du Bois, was a compromise kind of education, where, of course, Frederick Du Bois focused on Black Americans having exactly the same educational opportunities and ambition as white Americans. Are you critical of that element of Booker T's life?
Absolutely. I'm openly critical of it in the book, even. And I lay out the arguments of exactly what Booker T. Washington was doing and his viewpoints on what he was doing and the criticisms of him even during his lifetime from people like W.E.B. Du Bois, as you point out. That people like Du Bois believed what Booker T. Washington was doing, and people of his ilk, was that they were engaging in respectability politics, that they were scraping and bowing to powerful whites in an effort to try to just nudge the Black community up a few notches on the economic food pyramid, so to speak, in hopes that someday that, joining the ranks of the middle class would bring about racial equality. That was a very big criticism of him during his own lifetime, and it remains one. And yet, one of the things that I also point out is that despite their divergent viewpoints on exactly what the best way to achieve racial equality was, in many ways, Du Bois and Washington were working for the same goal. They had different viewpoints on how to achieve it. And it's easy to sit from our perspective of modernity, our present perspective, and judge how both men have gone about their work of trying to achieve racial equality. It's easy for us in the year 2024 to say, well, Booker really had it wrong. And W.E.B. Du Bois was correct because he was advocating for full equality and integration. He was correct. And from Booker's perspective at the time, there was absolutely no sense that Americans were ready to achieve full equality. And so in his mind, he's thinking, so the answer then is what? Not educate the children while we're waiting for people to get on board with the idea of full equality, leave the children illiterate and unable to advance in society while we're waiting for whites to give us permission for, to enter the power structure. From his perspective, he believed it was important to educate the children in front of him. It's a little bit like this. If I say, we really should address systemic childhood poverty in the United States. The United States is such a developed and wealthy country. It's a tragedy that we have childhood poverty. We should take steps to address that. That is true. And we should also feed the children who are hungry in front of us at this moment. We should not say to the children who are currently facing food shortages, I'm sorry, you know what? We're going to do things to address the systemic poverty, and eventually that will lead to you having enough food. It's an and. We have to feed the children in front of us now and address systemic poverty. So I think that that's one way that sometimes it's easy to get, it's easy to view history through these very black and white terms of good guy, bad guy, right idea, wrong idea, when in reality, the truth is far more nuanced.
You must have had a lot of fun, Sharon, doing this book. I'm sure there were many other Americans you could have written about. The small and the mighty. There are two people who show up towards the end of the book. Daniel Inouye, who was a senator from Hawaii, and Norman Mineta, who was in the U.S. cabinet and now has an airport named after him in San Jose. I wouldn't have expected either of these guys to show up, partly because they're not necessarily the most famous Americans. They're certainly not A-listers in any sense. And also, in a sense, they're not really small. What ties these guys together, or at least their families and their histories in 20th century America?
Well, when they began making a difference in the United States, they certainly were small. And I think what's part of interesting about their stories is how they become mighty. What is their path to power? And, Norman Mineta's family was 10 years old when the United States government decided it was going to incarcerate Japanese Americans who lived on the West Coast. His family was from San Jose, and as you pointed out, there's now an airport named after him. He eventually became the mayor of San Jose, by the way, before he ever made it to Congress. But his family is incarcerated despite having been accused of no crime and despite having done nothing wrong. His dad's just an insurance agent. His family has all of their money seized by the United States government. They have to rent out their family home. He loses his insurance license. Their entire existence was upended, and they were put in a prison camp along with their children. The Minettas were. And of course, what Norman Mineta goes on to do with his life is of remarkable importance. But his relationship with Daniel Inouye is a unique aspect of the story. But Daniel was also from a Japanese American family, and he lived in Hawaii. And so, unlike people who were living in California or Oregon or Washington, the United States government decided that it was too difficult to incarcerate all of the Japanese Americans living in Hawaii. They were too large of a percentage of the population, and there was just nowhere to put them. So they decide that instead of incarcerating them, we're just going to increase surveillance on the Japanese Americans who live in Hawaii. Well, eventually, Daniel Inouye is allowed to serve in World War II in what becomes the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most recognized and recognized units in all of World War II. They have more commendations, more medals than any other unit of its size, and it is a combat team that is made up entirely of Japanese Americans, people who had been denied the right to serve because of the security risks. He goes. I won't spoil the story, but he goes to Italy, and something really remarkable happens to him there. And what both he and Norman Mineta go on to do, despite having been treated so badly by their own government, what they go on to do with their lives really does make them both small and mighty.
Well, I'm not going to fly. Not that I often fly into Mineta Airport, but when I do, I'll think of you.
Thank you.
Sharon, you end the book with a section called Momentum. Most of the book is a more traditional historical narrative. You begin in the early 19th century, you progress to the 20th century. But in the last section of the book, in Momentum, you cover a couple of small and mighty Americans. Claudette Colvin, who is an American contemporary American civil rights activist, and Septima Clark, who was a 19th century activist or late 19th century activist. What ties them together, and what's the importance of momentum in your book?
Momentum, first of all, the title is about, if you think about it from the sense of nudging the arc of the moral universe, that eventually the nudging begins to make a large bend, and you develop this momentum to keep making progress. Maybe it's more like a ball rolling down a hill, that we're developing momentum towards changes that America has worked for hundreds of years. We see all kinds of things beginning to happen all at one time during this roughly decade period from the mid 1950s to the mid 1960s. Tremendous progress was made. So Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old girl who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus before Rosa Parks ever did such a thing. And this is no shade to Rosa Parks, but Claudette was also not alone.
The fifth Beatle, so to speak.
Yes. Rosa Parks was not alone in her refusal to give up her seat on the bus. And there's a reason Rosa Parks becomes famous and these other people are less well known in history. And Claudette Colvin eventually becomes a party to a very important Supreme Court case. She becomes a pregnant 16-year-old who felt very ill-equipped, who loses her jobs because people keep recognizing her at the places that she's working, and it becomes difficult for her to support her child. But ultimately, her courage makes significant progress in the civil rights movement. But Septima Clark is perhaps one of my most favorite characters in the entire book. She is a woman who was born in 1898. She becomes a teacher herself. She has a set of life circumstances that no one would ever want to trade places with. She finds out she marries and has a baby, and her baby has a undiagnosed birth defect and dies a few weeks after being born. And shortly thereafter, she becomes pregnant again, has another child, and then discovers that her husband has an entirely secret second life and that he is married to another woman, has children with another woman, and shortly thereafter, her husband dies, leaving her to try to care for this child that she has. As you know, it is often difficult for single mothers to care for to provide for their children. It still is difficult for single mothers to provide for their children in many ways. And suffice it to say, the remainder of her life is very, very challenging. She is very depressed, contemplates suicide. A number of times, she narrowly escapes death. She is fired from her job. She is falsely accused and arrested of crimes. And she goes on to start something called Citizenship School. And she goes on to teach a woman named Rosa Parks how to become a political activist for freedom, for equality. And it is Septima Clark and the people who helped build citizenship schools who give Rosa Parks and women like her the tools to go on to create that kind of momentum in the United States. And one of the things that Septima says at the end of her life that I think is really remarkable and worth remembering. People ask her, "What have you learned through all of your journeys working for civil rights? What have you learned?" And she says, "I have learned that I can work with my enemies because they might have a change of heart at any moment." And what a remarkable thing to think from a woman who has suffered incredible injustice throughout her entire life. I can work with my enemies because they might have a change of heart at any moment. And how exactly would your enemies ever have a change of heart if you're unwilling to work with them? If
Yeah,
you
do you
cut
think that sort of magnanimity, is that an American thing or just a human thing?
I think there are people like this all over the world.
Or
I
maybe a Black America thing, given the crimes. It was interesting. We spoke, Sharon, yesterday to Congressman Jamie Raskin. He was in Congress, or he's the House of Representatives figure who has been responsible for impeaching Trump. He's a very distinguished man on the left. We talked about his experience growing up in the 80s. And he focused on, in the 80s as a student, as an undergraduate at Harvard and then at Harvard Law School, on civil rights, not in America, but in South Africa. And one of the things I asked him was, has the civil rights struggle in America ended? I wasn't entirely convinced by his answer. And I'm curious for you, given the focus, not only on civil rights, but whether it's African Americans or Daniel Inouye and Norman Mineta, there is a focus on civil rights, which ends, at least in the book, your final chapter is on Montgomery, Alabama in 1953. Has that narrative ended for America in the 2020s? Or are the issues that are addressed in your book, are they still very much alive today in an America which is on the brink of what some people think of as a historic election? The small and the mighty. What are the lessons, in other words, from this book for the America of 2024?
The struggle for rights is not over, and we cannot become complacent in our guarding of those rights. Now, has America made incredible progress? Of course, of course. And this book traces much of that progress. You can see where we begin and where we end and how much has happened in this book in the struggle for progress. So tremendous progress has been made, absolutely. But there is still a significant effort on the parts of some individuals to try to curtail the rights of certain people. I see this online all the time, this sort of narrative that there are the right people to vote and the wrong people to vote. And that is an idea that there's the right people, there are the good people to vote and the wrong people to vote. That idea goes all the way back to colonial America when the viewpoint was only white men, rich white men should be allowed to vote. So this idea that we're still struggling with who the right people to vote are demonstrates that the fight is not over. People are still working to make it more difficult to vote. And voting, of course, is only one of the many civil rights, but it's just an example of how the struggle continues.
Yeah, and we've had Carol Anderson on this show, actually, other writers focusing on that. Finally, Sharon, America, of course, will be celebrating its 250th anniversary in a couple of years, in July 4th, 2026. How do you think you'll be celebrating? Will you be looking backwards or forwards? Will you be waving a flag or burning the flag?
Well, I will definitely be waving it. And I think it's both. History gives me hope. History creates a, a community of ancestors from which to draw inspiration. And many of the people in this book are the best of us. And they are people that I hope to emulate in the future. We can take these lessons from the past and move them into the progress that we want to continue seeing in the United States. So I'm excited. I'm excited for this big momentous event, and I will definitely be there with bells on.
Well, Sharon McMahon, the author of The Small and the Mighty, Small and Mighty in Your Own Way. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
And I'd love to get you back on the show, maybe after the election, to get your sense of the current state of America. Some people are fearful, others